Hey buddy. Back in 1995, on a random Saturday morning on the Coast to Coast radio show, the host Art Bell read an article that was faxed to him from Missouri. It read, "Kansas City man tries to build time machine on porch." Mike Markham, a 20-year-old factory worker in Missouri, had apparently been arrested and spent several months in prison for stealing 6 large electrical transformers from his local utilities department. His story was that he was using one of them to increase the voltage of a device that he had cobbled together using a Jacob's ladder and laser emitters from CD players that he claims was able to create a small portal doorway that he used to send small items a short distance forward in time.
The story is entitled, "Kansas City Man Tries to Build Time Machine on Porch." Kansas City Associated Press. When a Missouri factory worker set out to make a time machine on his back porch.
That's right, according to Mike, he had created a small time machine in his home. Basically, he would throw small items into this device and they would reappear hours or days later in a completely different location, either east or west of his home. Mike would appear on the Coast to Coast radio show a few days later to be interviewed by Art Bell, where he would explain how he built his device, how it worked, and what his plans were for the future of his time machine. Well, around 18 years later, Mike would decide to test this device on himself. He jumped into the portal that his time machine created just to see what would happen. And the story goes that Mike would then disappear for over 2 years, leaving his fans and his followers confused and concerned about what had happened to him, until he then reappeared in 2015, I believe, to give another interview to Art Bell, where he had claimed that he had traveled 2 years into the future. Now, all of this seems like a tall tale. It doesn't really seem possible that a 20-year-old could accidentally create a time machine just by playing around with electricity, let alone a time machine that could successfully send him 2 years into the future. Most people would have just completely dismissed this story on the face of it. But in that original article that Art Bell read on the air in 1995, they had interviewed the chairman for the Department of Physics for the University of Kansas City to see his opinion on Mike's time machine. And the chairman of physics says that Mike wasn't actually that far off, that theoretically his device could have worked. And there might actually be some validity to Mike's claims.
The contraption he came up with was not completely off the mark, theoretically, according to scientists. Time travel, though enticingly possible in the mathematics of Einstein's theory of relativity, is not likely in the physical universe, they say. It is a very interesting area, though. There are theoretical physicists working on those areas, and I will not say that it's total nonsense. This was according to the chairman at the physics department at the University of Missouri at Kansas City.
He also said that that transformer that he stole was more likely to have blown up his house or accidentally unalived somebody in the vicinity, but he said that Mike's time machine actually made sense. So was Mike lying? Could his story even be true? Is it possible that Mike Markham was actually able to send things forward in time? Did he really build a time machine in his home? Or was this all just a bit of media sensationalism that got out of hand? In his first Art Bell interview in 1995, Mike claimed that he had been running these experiments out of his home for quite some time, and the people in his neighborhood had to have been getting suspicious that something was going on because he was causing regular brownouts and blackouts in the region. And Mike says that this is why he had to steal that transformer, because he needed a way to increase the electrical output for his Jacob's ladder without blowing out the entire power grid. The story is that Mike started all of this just by running some experiments with a Jacob's ladder in his home, and he wanted to see what would happen when he increased the voltage. He had rigged up a bunch of different ideas to try to achieve this, like wrapping wire around the stems of the Jacob's ladder, hooking up batteries, and even firing lasers at the stems that he had taken out of CD players. He says that he even managed to create a rotating magnetic field, which people pointed out sounds pretty similar to the Philadelphia experiment, where people claim to have created rotating magnetic fields using Tesla coils to teleport a ship from one bay to another. Now, Mike had been running these experiments for a while, but one day after he managed to get his Jacob's ladder up to 20,000 volts using that transformer, he noticed that there was a distortion above the Jacob's ladder that kind of looked like wavy air when air is hot. And he wasn't sure if this was a portal or just some sort of electrical distortion, but he realized that when he threw things at this wavy air distortion, they would disappear. He had thrown a few small things into this distortion, like screws and pens, but after they would disappear, he wasn't sure where they were going. At first, he thought that they were just vaporizing, but then he started to wonder if they were teleporting. That is, until he started to throw more recognizable items through this distortion, and they would then reappear hours or days later in a completely different location. Mike claims that at one point, he even threw a few hamsters through this distortion, and they traveled several days into the future. Art Bell called Mike Markham Madman Mike for his extreme approach to his homemade time machine. It's wild that someone would even try to rig something up like this in their living room. He could have been unalived at any point by getting hit by an arc of electricity, or even if he got too close to the electrical field. Hell, he could have even burnt his house down, or as that physics professor said, it could have blown it up.
With a high-voltage electrical transformer that Michael Markham had hooked up to 2 vertical metal rods would more likely have killed him or blown up his house than carried him into the past or future.
But Madman Mike had become an overnight celebrity from this story and his appearance on Coast to Coast. Hundreds of people wanted to help him by donating money and resources. Even a local guy let Mike use his warehouse for free to continue his experiments, as long as Mike paid for the electricity, of course. Mike gained a huge following, but this was back in the 90s, remember, before there was any kind of social media. It wasn't very easy for his fans to follow along with his progress. And like I said, after 18 years of running these experiments, Mike just suddenly disappeared for over 2 years. His internet followers were scrambling to figure out what could have happened to him. People theorized that he could have been disappeared from the government for coming up with a forbidden technology, or maybe he had tested the time machine on himself and he got lost in a different era, or maybe he was even vaporized by his device. Lost forever without a trace. The point is, it was a huge mystery and there were a lot of theories floating around. One internet sleuth even managed to find an article from the 1930s describing a John Doe that had passed away in a strange metal tube that had washed ashore. Many of his followers thought that that could have been Mike. Maybe he had accidentally traveled back in time only to lose his life in an accident. That is, until he just magically reappeared in 2015 to give another interview on Coast to Coast with Art Bell. In this interview, Art Bell kept saying that it's been 20 years since the last time they talked, but according to Mike, it had only been 18 years, which is an interesting little detail. In this second interview from 2015, Mike says that he managed to increase the power to his Jacob's Ladder device to the point where it would open up a portal large enough for a human to enter. Up to this point, he had only really ever tested this device on small items and small animals like hamsters. He hadn't even tested his device on anything smarter than that, like cats or dogs, even though his followers kept requesting that he try that. Mike says that he wasn't comfortable testing it on anything else that was alive other than himself, of course. So Mike decided to test this device on himself. Madman Mike. His new Jacob's Ladder device was much taller than the original from 1995. I think it was over 30 feet tall or something like that. So he had to hire a crane or something to lift him 35 feet up into the air just so that he could enter the portal. So one day he hoisted himself 35 feet up into the air using this crane, and he jumped down into the doorway. The next thing he knows, he's waking up alone in a field in a strange location. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know who he is. He's completely lost his memory. Mike believes that his mind was wiped from the electromagnetic field when he passed through the portal. The Jacob's Ladder device wiped his memory. Mike was lost and confused. He wandered around for a while until he eventually found his way to a homeless shelter where he decided to stay for several months, until he eventually regained his memory and made his way back to his warehouse, which was several towns over from where he landed. Mike says that he realized that 2 years had passed since he had jumped into the machine, and the whole world had moved on without him. His warehouse had been cleared out. There was a new tenant there, and all of his stuff had been evicted. All of his technology was gone. The landlord clearly thought Mike had skipped town, so he evicted all of his stuff. Mike still has no idea where any of his equipment is to this day. Which is kinda convenient if all of this is fake. There have been a lot of popular time traveler stories over the years. Art Bell even mentioned a few of them in his interview with Mike, saying that they all eventually disappear at some point. Like Tidor, we all know Tidor. Art Bell insinuated that these time travelers disappearing implies that they had either traveled through time again and were somewhere else, or maybe they were eliminated by some sort of a government agency that wanted to get rid of them. I mean, I guess nobody really knows what happens to them, not even Art Bell, but the point is that they all eventually disappear and they all go quiet. And during that 2-year period where nobody knew where he was, everyone kind of just assumed that Madman Mike was another one of these time travelers that disappeared, vaporized into the ether. Now, Mike has kind of disappeared again. There aren't a lot of people that know exactly where he is now, but Mike is a little bit different, because even though nobody really knows for sure where he ended up, and there are only really online rumors about his current whereabouts, we're assured by sources that have apparently had contact with Mike that he's doing okay, that he's just living his life quietly now. And that's more or less the gist of the famous time traveler story of Madman Mike. So, is any of this true? Could any of this even be true? I know that this might be a little bit shocking, no pun intended, but I'm a little bit skeptical of this story. This just simply does not seem possible. Over the years, there have been some really interesting criticisms brought up for this story. Some of the best criticisms actually came from people who were calling into Art Bell's show during his interview with Mike. I know that a lot of stories like this get popular because they were featured on Art Bell's show, Coast to Coast AM, or later his newer show, Midnight in the Desert, I think it was called. Art Bell made a lot of different characters like this famous over the years. But the only thing about this story that seems to give it any kind of legitimacy was the original newspaper story out of Missouri that interviewed the chairman of physics from the University of Kansas City. That initial article was the original framing for this entire story. And with this story coming from a reputable news agency, and with it including an interview from a physics professor who said that Mike's experiments were not impossible, that all gave this story a lot more weight than I think that it ever really deserved to begin with. It's because it was in the news as a not impossible thing that it even ended up on Coast to Coast AM in the first place. This is the main reason that I think that people even believe this story to begin with. Now, I haven't had much luck actually finding this original news article. It's possible that it was never real. Mike has been in the news multiple times since then. There are lots of different reputable and popular news outlets that have talked about this. So, assuming that that original newspaper article was real, based on what Art Bell read on the air, I still don't think that there's a good reason to take this story seriously. To me, it just sounds like a media sensationalism. Just like the news pieces that we see today where a Harvard professor tells the world that a comet we're seeing fly past the sun might be alien technology, or when a former Pentagon official comes onto CNN saying that aliens and UFOs are real. Or like that former director of defense who wrote a book about the Galactic Federation saying that aliens had been visiting us. This time machine story has the exact same kind of vibe as those. These stories all carry the weight of a legitimate news piece, but they all lack interesting proof or even evidence. It's just stories sold to us as facts. And when these stories include a person who was there, who saw it, who lived it, it makes those stories seem a lot more believable. And that first episode of Art Bell's show makes this story seem pretty believable too. There's a lot of really good theater in that episode. They even had Mike's arresting officer call in to make a comment, or at least somebody pretending to be Mike's arresting officer.
Hi, this is Stanbury, Missouri, arresting officer.
Oh, you are the...
Tom Hampton.
Hi, Mike, how you doing, boy?
Hey, you still got my diary, don't you?
You bet, sitting here on the desk.
You are the arresting officer?
Yes, sir.
Wow.
It's great to meet you. I don't know if it's great for Michael. Are you guys friends?
Are we friends, Mike?
Yeah.
Yeah, sort of.
Michael, were you surprised to hear from your arresting officer?
Yeah. Very.
Me too.
That was like quite a coincidence.
There was even a woman who called in during that episode freaking out that what they're talking about might encourage people to try to build their own time machine in their own homes, which is a legitimate concern, to be honest. That's pretty dangerous. That episode does go into a lot of detail about how somebody could build their own rig just like Mike's in their own home. And if they did that, they could accidentally burn their house down, they could accidentally unalive someone, or they could accidentally blow up their house. But my biggest problem with this Madman Mike persona is that Mike kind of plays both sides when it comes to how intelligent and how capable he is. I'm kind of confused with his competence level in general. On one hand, you have Mike acting like he's this hapless fool who has no idea what's going on half the time. He just accidentally stumbled across this time-traveling technology while he was playing around with electricity in his living room.
Like I said before, I didn't set out to build a time machine.
As is so many times the case with any discovery, you were simply trying to build a Jacob's ladder.
Yeah, just like something fancy to watch thing.
Just to see the spark go up.
Yeah,
something cool to do. I understand that perfectly.
And even after he started throwing things into this portal, he was still scrambling to try to figure out what was actually going on with them. He had already sacrificed multiple items into this portal before he had any idea what was happening. Then, on the other hand, Mike had a really good, intelligent answer for every single criticism that he received about this device, and was able to explain how he was able to get the results that he did. For example, a caller pointed out that the Earth moves through space. So if you're jumping through time, a time machine portal would likely have you reappear out in space if it's sending you to a different time period. You wouldn't just end up going a little bit further east or west. You wouldn't end up in just some other town. You would have ended up floating out in deep space alone. But of course, Mike says that he's pretty sure he knows why that was happening. Mike says that the Earth's magnetic field was keeping everything tied to the Earth. So anytime he sent something forward in time, it was being held inside of our atmosphere by the magnetic field. Now, that's a really good explanation for a piece of fiction or a sci-fi television show or something, but there's no way that Mike could have known that. And there's no way that he could have figured it out with his limited equipment and knowledge. Another criticism had to do with how far forward things were being sent into the future. With smaller items like the pens and screws and stuff, it was only sending them a few hours into the future. With the hamsters, it was maybe like a day or two. But for some reason, when Mike jumped through the portal, it sent him 2 years into the future, exponentially further forward than anything else that went through that portal. People have pointed out that that's a bit confusing. Well, Mike has an answer for that. Mike claims that the distance forward that an object travels through time has to do with the mass of that object. The larger the object, the further forward it goes. And because Mike was the largest thing that ever entered that portal, it sent him the furthest forward in time. Yeah. Again, there's basically no way that Mike could know that, and that answer doesn't really make any sense anyways. I don't even really understand how he's coming up with any of these theories or how he's coming to these conclusions to begin with. These answers only really seem to exist in order to answer these criticisms. And then there's the point about him losing his memory for a little while, and he claims that it's because the electromagnetic field he traveled through wiped his mind. I mean, that sounds good, but again, I don't know how he came to that conclusion. And if that's true and that's what really happened, I don't understand how he managed to regain his memory. I'm not really sure that's how memory works. His story would make a lot more sense if he said that he got amnesia because he hit his head or something when he landed on the other side. Like, that's more believable. That kind of amnesia we've witnessed before, and we do know that people can recover from that. But literally frying your brain with electricity? I don't know, man. But the thing that makes me doubt this story the most is the fact that it was so heavily featured on Art Bell's Coast to Coast show. I mean, I love Art Bell. His shows are some of the best entertainment I've ever experienced in my life. But he regularly had guests and callers on his shows that would totally make up fake stories about all sorts of bullshit. Art Bell had a saying to the callers of his show. It was something like, "Your story had better be true." And if it's not true, it had better be convincing. And that's something that I always had in the back of my mind every time I listened to an episode of his show. A saying like that might sound like he's encouraging his guests to only tell true stories, but what he's really doing is he's encouraging guests to be very convincing in their fake stories. And Art Bell would regularly play along, even when he could tell that a story was fake. He'd still talk about it like it was a true story. The best he would do is just hurry a guest along if they were taking too long or if their story wasn't very convincing. I mean, Art Bell did talk about a few things on his show that I'm pretty sure are true or could be true. But with Mike Markham specifically, most people only really know about this time machine story because of Art Bell, because of Coast to Coast AM. Art Bell had a ton of guests on his show that were professional bullshit artists. A lot of people that I personally think are totally full of shit. Like David Paulides, the missing 411 guy, was on his show several times. Linda Moulton Howe was a regular guest on Coast to Coast AM, and I don't believe a word that comes from this woman. And a lot of hucksters and hoaxsters peddled their stories on his show. In the end, I think that this saga of Madman Mike Markham is really just a story about a kid who got arrested for stealing an electrical transformer to increase or enhance his experiments in his living room. And this all got out of hand, and he became a big media sensation when his local newspaper reported that he was trying to build a time machine, and they had a professor from a university say that his experiment was not impossible. He's just a young guy that was playing with electricity at home, and he got caught by the local authorities because he stole something. That's it. It got sensationalized and it flooded the news cycle for a while to give people something bizarre to talk about. But it was probably never really meant to be taken seriously. But tell me what you think. Was Madman Mike Markham actually able to build a time machine? Do you think that it's even possible to build a time machine? Or was this just some media sensationalism that got blown out of proportion? Was this only really ever meant to be a curiosity on a fringe show like Coast to Coast AM? Let me know in the comments below. And thank you so much to my patrons and my channel members for supporting my videos. I could not do this without you. People who support my channel get to watch my videos in advance, and you also get access to exclusive content. Again, thank you so much. I love you guys.